Hear the words of encouragement in the poem As Kingfishers Catch Fire by Gerald Manley Hopkins. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame, as tumbled over rim in roundy wells. Stone ring, like each tucked string tells, each hung bells. Bow swung fine tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same. Deal out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves goes itself. Myself it speaks and spells. Crying what I do is me, for what I came. I say more, the just man's justices keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces. Acts in God's eyes, what in God's eye he is. Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000 places. Lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. For the acclamation of God's glory in diverse humanity, we thank.
Hear words from the Gospel of Luke. When they had reached the place called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there, together with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Abba, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing." Then they divided his garments, rolling dice for them. The people stood there watching. The rulers, however, jeered him and said, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he really is the Messiah of God, the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him. They served Jesus sour wine and said, "If you are really the King of the Jews, save yourself." There was an inscription above Jesus that read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there beside him insulted Jesus too, saying, "Are you really the Messiah? Then save yourself and us." But the other answered the first with a rebuke. "Don't you even fear God? We are only paying the price for what we have done, but this one has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your glory." Jesus replied, "The truth is, today you'll be with me in paradise." For the redeeming power of God in Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God.
May I speak, and may we all reflect in the name of God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. How do you regard dragonflies? In the poem, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, the poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, not only encourages us to be like dragonflies, but thereby to be like Christ. Not everyone has agreed, however. In early colonial Australia, for example, whitefellas tried to kill dragonflies. Those early colonialists saw dragonflies flying around and landing on their valuable horses, and they saw the horses moving and flicking their tails. So they thought the dragonflies were biting the horses and making them crook. The colonialists were actually making things worse. The dragonflies were actually eating the mosquitoes, one of the gifts they are to the world, and the gnats that were troubling the horses. So the dragonflies were life givers. They were even saviours, not devils in disguise. In such ways, dragonflies are therefore evocative symbols for transgender people today. Because on this Transgender Day of Remembrance, we do well to attend how bearers of light, which dragonflies are spectacularly, have been treated as embodiments of darkness. We do well, as our gospel today reminds us, to remember how Jesus was not crucified alone, but how so many others were crucified with him. And above all, we do well to affirm that it is only in recognizing the light, sometimes in strange places, like on a rubbish heap with the crucified, that we find salvation and hope for us all. I won't speak personally in a moment, and what I have to say is not easy, either to say or for some of us to hear. Because the Transgender Day of Remembrance raises human suffering of various kinds. So I want to give a trigger warning, and not least for those who know the pain that comes and lies behind both murder and self-harm, even the self-harm that brings death. For this Memorial Day is not just about gender identity at all. There are many positive reasons why transgender people are like dragonflies, even though we sometimes get treated as devils. But we also reveal many aspects of wider human suffering in the negativity we experience. So let me begin with some statistics. We actually have no real idea how many transgender people are killed across the world because of who we are. As in this country, until quite recently, and let's face it, census returns and such like are still not recording us, transgender people have been made invisible in many official records. Because enabling invisibility is, after all, the easiest way to erase people. We white fellas did it to Aboriginal people, as, for example, when we proclaimed that Truganini was the last of her people in Tasmania. Well, hello, welcome to Gary Deverell, who is here. It's just not true. We therefore have no real adequate picture of who and what transgender people really are and experience in our fullness. But the records we do have highlight suffering which is not only quite unnecessary and which makes me impatient for change, I am sorry if that's awkward for some people, but which highlights other key human concerns. For not only have the numbers of recorded murders of transgender people across the world been rising, but the issues behind the Trans Day of Remembrance are nothing if not intersectional. The statistics state global inequalities starkly. Let me highlight 4 aspects. Firstly, of those transgender people who have been murdered in 2021, 96% were transgender women or trans feminine. Why? It's a no-brainer, isn't it? It's because transphobia and hate are inextricably bound up with patriarchy and sexism. Notwithstanding a few high-profiled women speaking against transgender liberation, transphobia is a weapon to dismantle so much that the women's movement has gained. For transphobia is about trying to gain full power over the bodies and the souls of those who have traditionally been othered and subjugated. It puts and seeks to put into place all who have risen against patriarchal control. Secondly, the statistics we have show that in 2021, for example, the numbers of murdered transgender people doubled in the United States of America alone, and 53% of those who were killed were people of colour. So things aren't just getting better, or at least where progress is being made, it is met with violence. And you can see that starkly in the United States, you can see it in the United Kingdom, and even though we have changed our federal government, it could happen here. For good news, as our gospel today reminds us, is always typically met with powerful resistance, with violence and even death for those who bear it, especially if they're not people of privilege. So transphobia is also intimately bound up with racism and with Black Lives Matter. Thirdly, analysis of recorded data shows that 43% of transgender people murdered in Europe in 2021 were migrants. Because trans issues are also about refugees and asylum seekers. They're about xenophobia, poverty, and inhospitality, as well as manifest racism. So no wonder you see that right-wing politics and Christians and media seek to distract people with foolish stuff about transgender people and concentrate on framing those issues in the way they choose and shape. Because if we're to take transphobia and its violence seriously, we have to address these other major issues. They are interconnected. Trans people aren't a special case. We are part of the change we all need. Fourthly, what data we do have shows that roughly half of recorded murders of transgender people are of sex workers. This reinforces how transphobia is intimately linked to male violence and patriarchy, racism, but also to poverty and marginalisation. So no wonder Western culture has tried to identify some of us trans people as perverts, sexualising us for generations as disturbing figures that are not worthy of moral concern, even as they have denied visibility, voices and value to us. No wonder then that religion is becoming the last and greatest bastion of bigotry, with hate and violent consequences. Because transphobia is founded on the maintenance of cruel difference and othering, and the maintenance of purity codes and stigmatization. So we are, therefore, to return to the gospel story, all of us made criminal and, in a sense, crucified. Let me relate this to my personal journey. Significantly, as it now seems, on the very same day that Penny and I formally approached the Uniting Church about the possibility of ministry within it, I heard that a dear friend had ended her own life. Such devastation is not included in the recorded deaths remembered on this day, but it is intimately connected and very real. My friend was actually a Christian from an extraordinarily Middle East land of rich culture, but which has a deeply repressive regime. She was younger than me and beautiful in appearance and spirit. She had good friends in Brisbane, and apart from her father, a deeply loving and supportive family in her home country with whom I've been in correspondence this week. She'd come through the costly struggles of transition, including several demanding surgeries. But she ended her own life. Why? My experience is that we never know what is exactly happening in another person's life, and we shouldn't live in continuing anxiety and perplexity about that, nor certainly in guilt or shame if someone acts in such a way. We must rather hold all that is good about them in our hearts and memories. I've also never spoken publicly before about my friend, and I will always strive to honour her unique wonder rather than collude with her being just another statistic of social, political or other concerns. So as with others I have loved, who have ended their own lives. I have no answers, but I believe that part of their enduring value, and those who've been murdered and suffered other violence, is to ask us to do whatever we can to listen and support one another, especially those who are on the margins. And then they live alive here as well as in the greater love of God. The other day I met a particularly beautiful young transgender woman, and I asked her how she was going. She paused for a moment in evident struggle and simply replied, "I am still alive. I'm still alive." That's enough for many transgender people to achieve. They're the realities some of us live with every day, and they have to be transformed. And I say that to churches, including the Uniting Church. Not enough is done, and what we do today in remembrance is to light further candles so that people can not only stay alive, but can thrive in their glorious diversity. Events like that conversation on my friend's death cut me typically daily to the heart. I led my friend's funeral, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The final straw for her seems to have been an encounter in a well-known clothing store in Brisbane. She'd chosen a dress to try on and asked where the female changing room was. The male attendant pointed it out, but smirked and called her sir. I've had that experience, lots of people have. For my friend, it was the turning point, however, because after all she'd gone through, and though she was so gorgeous, so feminine, so herself, even though that man was so crass, so offensive, and so part of an old world which, if too slowly, is changing, even though she knew most of the time that God truly, truly loved her, just as she is and was. Because it's not, after all, simply the murders and the violence which bring people down, is it? It's also the little things, the microaggressions. That's why some things matter to gender diverse people that don't matter to others. Like the language we use, including language in liturgy, the pronouns we use, and the way we talk to one another, the toilet signs and the awareness needed. And we can get caught up with that, and actually trans people are quite happy to have generally mistakes made, provided that people's hearts are in the right place and we're working on it. As well as the bigger things, our politicians continue to dodge, like funding for surgeries which keep us alive, for healthcare, for necessary legal changes and the removal of gatekeepers, for the intentional education, employment and housing policies and resources we require. Now, is that being woke, as we're told? Is it because trans people are snowflakes? Or is it about choosing life, flourishing for everyone? Every little step makes a difference, and Remembrance Days like this today can strengthen our divinely human solidarity as well as honour the pain. Transgender people don't need anybody's sympathy, never mind pity. We are wonderful, and if churches don't want to know us, then we'll go somewhere else, as many of us are going. But we invite churches and others to walk with us into the way of freedom, which is also a way of freedom for others. We only want life, and life for us all. Solidarity, even in the worst of suffering, and fullness of life. They're the two great themes we surely see in today's gospel reading. For this carefully crafted scene of crucifixion is intended to give us hope. We're not told, are we, whether the criminals on the cross, or much about them at all. We don't know what they were, what gender they were, whether they were transgender females, black, migrants, or sex workers, for example. Who knows? They were almost certainly poor, though, and victims of the inequalities and violence of the ancient world. We're not told anything about the context of their crimes or how they were defined by others. What we do know is that they represent the outsiders whom conventional society had labelled and sought to punish. And so with Jesus, they hang on crosses as literally tortured symbols for others to learn from, not to be like those people. On a rubbish heap, on the edge of the city, on the edge of so-called civilized life. That is where we find God, not in elaborate church rituals or other places of power and wealth, but on the rubbish heap, on the edge of civilized life, those of us who have been criminalized or are treated as criminals. The crucified person who asks for Jesus' help therefore represents all of us who seek God's grace, which is always there and open for us, even in the most desperate of circumstances. Because note how Jesus responds. He doesn't dwell on who that other person is or what they've done. He simply offers solidarity and hope. For Jesus is crucified with the others by the same powers. They share the same pain. And so Jesus affirms our common humanity in responding. If you and I and everyone else cannot find solidarity in our different yet common sufferings, what hope is there for us? That is what the gospel is saying. But if we can find hope, even in suffering, when we're criminalized or rejected or thrown onto the rubbish heap at the edge of civilized life, then we're able to be transformed by grace and find fresh hope for ourselves and for others. Because new life, as Jesus shares with us here, is not something to wait for in some future existence about which we can only really speculate. Hope and new life begin here, even in the worst of our sufferings, if we can see the light and let it in. Let me conclude by talking briefly about light bearing and suffering. It'd take too long to talk about all the spiritual symbolism of dragonflies, but one of the main characteristics is that dragonflies convey and share light. Like kingfishers, as the poet put it, dragonflies catch fire with the light. When you see them, their wings catch up and they take the sun and they transform life. Dragonflies draw flame. Dragonflies bring life alive and shine out that light to others with their wondrous wings and movements, subject for another sermon. No wonder that dragonflies are therefore so expressive symbols for transgender people. They encourage us all, like Christ, to see, to share, and shine with light. Now, butterflies are beautiful symbols too of God's light and creativity. Like dragonflies, they too have to transition, bearing the costs of metamorphosis. But dragonflies have it even tougher. Indeed, the dragonfly journey to full life can be quite grueling. For a start, unlike butterflies, dragonflies go straight from larvae to adulthood with no pupal stage in between. And in that process, they have to come out of the water and hatch. They have to learn to breathe air, and they're subject to predators and to rain and other climate changes which can damage and destroy them. Time is needed to redistribute their bodily fluids and push their true bodily features through their skin. And then they typically struggle to fly, being further vulnerable to predation. Today, the destruction of wetlands threatens their existence. But they survive. And as the poet says, they then shine. So for these and other reasons, transgender people are truly dragonfly people, and they encourage us to be dragonfly people too. That's the heart of the gospel today. Will our different sufferings destroy us, or can we connect through them and allow even our pain to be transfigured by renewing light and grace? Will we allow the powers of death to crush us like they tried to crush Jesus, whether it be our own personal demons or those of others? Patriarchy, racism, xenophobia, poverty, stigmatization. Or will we, with Jesus and all the dragonfly people, stand up in solidarity and hope renewed by light and grace? I was tempted to play the song from The Greatest Showman. You know the theme? This is me. If you don't, go home and play it. In those words sung by Kiala Seattle, they point us to the fact that none of us need to let others deprive our souls and lives of the greatest truth of all, that we are truly, utterly loved, just as we are. This is me, this is you, this is Christ, as the poet was trying to say. For there is indeed, as Jesus was trying to say, as the words of the song put it, a place for all of us, for we are glorious. In the name of Christ, who plays in 10,000 places and more. Amen.